I never imagined that standing on that stage, under those blazing television lights, I would be staring into the eyes of the man who once threw me out like garbage. But life has a way of writing its own perfect endings, doesn't it? Let me take you back to where it all began. To a 17-year-old girl who thought she knew what love was, who thought her family would catch her when she fell. I was wrong about both. The pregnancy test sat on my bathroom counter for 3 hours before I could bring myself to look at it. 2 pink lines. 2 tiny lines that would change everything. I remember touching my stomach, whispering to the life growing inside me, promising I would protect them no matter what. I had no idea how much that promise would cost me. I was a good student. Honor roll, debate team, the kind of daughter who made her parents proud at school functions. I had plans for college, dreams of becoming a teacher, maybe a writer. I was dating a boy from my literature class, sweet, awkward, with eyes that lit up when he talked about books. We were young and reckless and thought we had all the time in the world. The night it happened, we were studying for finals in his basement. His parents were out of town, and we were alone in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. We talked about the future, about going to college together, about all the adventures we would have. It felt like love. It felt like forever. It felt like the beginning of everything. 3 weeks later, I was throwing up every morning and couldn't stand the smell of coffee. 3 weeks after that, I was staring at those 2 pink lines, feeling my entire world tilt sideways. I rehearsed the conversation with my parents 100 times. I imagined tears, disappointment, maybe even anger. But I never imagined the cold silence that followed my words. My father's face turned to stone. My mother couldn't even look at me. The house fell so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "You've brought shame to this family," my father said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "How could you do this to us, to our reputation?" I tried to explain about the boy I loved, about how we were young and made a mistake, about how I was scared and needed them. But their concern wasn't for me or their unborn grandchild. It was for what the neighbors would think, what the community would say, what it would do to my father's rising political career. My father had been building his reputation for years. He was involved in local politics, always talking about family values and moral leadership. He gave speeches at churches about the importance of strong families. He was being groomed for bigger things, higher offices, and here I was, his teenage daughter, about to destroy everything he'd worked for. "People look up to me," he said, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "They trust me to represent their values. How am I supposed to do that when my own daughter can't even control herself?" The ultimatum came that night. Get rid of the baby or get out. Those were my choices. Simple, clean, heartless. "We know someone who can help," my mother said quietly, her hands shaking as she held out a business card. "It's safe. No one will ever know. We can all pretend this never happened." I looked at that card for a long time. I thought about how easy it would be to make this all go away, to go back to being their perfect daughter, to finish high school, to go to college like nothing had ever happened. But then I thought about the life growing inside me, about the promise I'd made to protect them. I thought about the boy I loved, who had cried when I told him and promised he would stand by me no matter what. I spent that whole night walking through our house, touching the walls I'd grown up against, memorizing the creaks in the floorboards. I thought about the little girl who used to spin in the living room, dreaming of her future. I thought about the teenager who believed her parents would love her no matter what. Both of those girls were about to disappear forever. I went to my room and looked at all the things that had defined my childhood. The books I'd read a dozen times each, the awards from school competitions, the photos of family vacations where we all looked so happy. I packed what I could carry and left the rest behind because I knew I was leaving more than just objects. I was leaving the version of myself that had believed in unconditional love. The next morning, I packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases. My father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me struggle with my belongings. I kept waiting for him to change his mind, to remember that I was his daughter, to remember that he used to call me his little star. Instead, he handed me an envelope with some cash and said, "This is all we can do for you. Don't come back." The money was enough for a few weeks of rent and food, not enough to build a life on, just enough to get me out of his sight. My mother cried silently in the kitchen. She never said goodbye. I walked out of that house carrying my entire world in 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces. I was 17 years old, pregnant, and completely alone. But I had made my choice. I chose love over convenience. I chose life over reputation. I chose my child over the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The boy I loved tried to help at first. He brought me groceries, helped me find my first apartment, held my hand during those early doctor visits. But his parents found out about us, and suddenly, he was forbidden from seeing me. I would catch glimpses of him at school, but he couldn't even look at me. His family was sending him away to boarding school, they said, to give him a fresh start. I finished high school through a program for teen mothers. I sat in a classroom full of other girls who had been cast out, who had been told they were mistakes, who were trying to build futures from broken pieces. We became each other's family, sharing babysitting duties and textbooks and the kind of encouragement that can only come from people who truly understand. The first few months were the hardest. I found a tiny apartment above a bakery, and the smell of fresh bread would make me so nauseous I could barely function. I worked at a diner during the day, serving coffee to people who looked right through me. My uniform smelled like grease, and my feet ached constantly, but I saved every penny I could. The diner was a place where stories collected like dust in the corners. I served coffee to construction workers starting their day at 5 in the morning. I brought pie to elderly men who came in every afternoon to escape their empty houses. I watched teenagers on dates, holding hands across sticky tables, and I remembered what it felt like to believe in forever. The other waitresses were kind to me. They saw my growing belly and somehow understood without me having to explain. They would slip me extra food, cover for me when I needed to sit down, and when my morning sickness was at its worst, they would handle my tables without complaint. When I finally went into labor, it was my manager who drove me to the hospital, cursing at every red light and telling me to breathe. I gave birth to my daughter on a Tuesday morning in February. The snow was falling outside my hospital window, and when they placed her in my arms, I understood what love actually meant for the first time in my life. Not the conditional love I'd grown up with, but something fierce and unbreakable. I looked at her perfect little face and made a promise that I would give her everything I never had. She was beautiful and terrible and completely mine. Her tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb, and I felt something shift inside me. All the fear and pain and loneliness of the past months suddenly had a purpose. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something. I was creating a life for both of us. The early years were a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry. I worked multiple jobs, cleaning offices at night, waitressing during the day, babysitting other people's children when I could find care for my own. Every dollar went toward rent, diapers, formula, and the small savings account I was slowly building for our future. My daughter grew up in that little apartment above the bakery. She took her first steps on the uneven wooden floors, spoke her first words while I was getting ready for work, and learned to read curled up next to me on our secondhand couch. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and somehow that felt like enough. I would read to her every night, even when I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. We would lie together in our small bed, and I would open worn library books and take us both to faraway places. She loved stories about brave children who went on adventures, about animals who talked and solved problems, about families who stuck together no matter what. When she started school, I realized I wanted to give her more than just survival. I wanted to give her dreams. I had always loved stories, and I began writing little tales to tell her at bedtime. Stories about brave princesses who didn't need rescuing, about animals who solved their own problems, about children who discovered they were stronger than they ever imagined. The stories started as a way to fill the quiet moments. When she was afraid of the dark, I would tell her about a little rabbit who learned that nighttime was just another kind of beautiful. When she was sad about not having a father, I would tell her about a family of birds where the mother was strong enough to teach her babies to fly all by herself. One day, while she was at school, I found myself writing these stories down. Really writing them, with characters and plots and endings that made me cry. I had no idea what I was doing, but something deep inside me felt alive for the first time in years. I would write during her naps, during my lunch breaks, in the quiet hours after she went to bed. The stories poured out of me like water from a broken dam. Stories about second chances and finding home in unexpected places. Stories about love that doesn't give up and courage that grows stronger in the darkness. Stories about all the things I wanted my daughter to know about the world and about herself. That's when I met him. The man who would become my husband, my partner, my best friend. He was the manager at the print shop where I went to make copies of my stories. He noticed me coming in week after week with these handwritten pages, and one day he asked what I was working on. I almost lied. I almost said it was nothing important. But something in his eyes made me tell the truth. He listened to me talk about my stories, about my dreams of maybe someday publishing children's books, and he didn't laugh. He didn't tell me to be realistic. Instead, he said, "Show me." He was different from anyone I'd ever met. He had grown up in a house full of books, with parents who encouraged his dreams instead of crushing them. He understood that stories mattered, that they could change lives, that they could help children make sense of a complicated world. He read my stories that night and called me the next morning. "These are beautiful," he said. "Kids need to read these. How can I help you make that happen?" We started our publishing company in his garage. I would write the stories, he would handle the business side, and we would produce small runs of books to sell at local schools and libraries. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely insane. But we believed in what we were doing. The first book we published was about a little girl who plants a garden after her old one gets destroyed in a storm. It was really about starting over, about finding beauty in the ruins, about growing something new from broken ground. We sold exactly 47 copies, and I treasured every single one. I remember the first time I held that book in my hands. It was real. It was something I had created, something that would outlast me, something that might help other children feel less alone in the world. My daughter was 8 years old, and she helped me sign every copy, her careful handwriting next to mine. Years passed. My daughter grew up surrounded by books and stories and the smell of fresh ink. She helped us pack orders, came up with character names, and always gave me honest feedback on my writing. She became the first reader for every story, and her approval meant more to me than any review ever could. The business grew slowly but steadily. We moved out of the garage and into a small office, then a bigger office. We started working with other authors, publishing books about friendship and courage and the kind of love that doesn't give up. Each book felt like a small victory, a proof that we were building something meaningful. We published books about children who were different, who didn't fit in, who had to find their own way in the world. We published books about families that looked different from the ones on television. We published books about resilience and hope, and the power of believing in yourself when no one else does. My daughter was in college when I wrote the story that changed everything. She was studying education, planning to become a teacher, carrying on the dream I had once abandoned. She was strong and confident, and everything I had hoped she would become. The story was about a family of foxes who had to leave their home during a terrible winter. The little fox was scared and missed her old life, but her mother showed her how to be brave, how to find new places to call home, how to create warmth even in the coldest places. I wrote it thinking about our own journey, about all the times we had to start over, about all the ways we had learned to make a home wherever we found ourselves. It was about resilience and adaptation, and the strength we find when we have no choice but to keep going. The story seemed to touch something universal. Parents wrote to tell me how it helped their children through difficult transitions. Teachers used it in their classrooms to help kids cope with divorce, moving, loss. Librarians recommended it to families facing their own upheavals. Within 6 months, it had become our best-selling book. Within a year, it was being read in schools across the country. The success was overwhelming. Suddenly, everyone wanted to interview me, to know my story, to understand how I had built something so meaningful from nothing. I gave talks at schools and libraries, sharing my message that every child deserves to feel seen and valued and loved. But I never told the whole story. I never talked about the night I was thrown out, about the father who chose politics over family, about the years of struggle and loneliness. I talked about single motherhood and following your dreams, but I kept the deepest pain private. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. The voice on the other end was professional and excited. "We'd like to honor your book with our National Children's Literature Award," they said. "It's a televised ceremony, and we'd be honored to have you there. The theme this year is Stories That Heal, and your work exemplifies exactly what we're celebrating." I accepted, of course. After all these years of working in obscurity, of building our little company one book at a time, this felt like validation, like proof that the scared 17-year-old girl who chose love over fear had made the right choice. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday evening in the spring. My husband bought a new suit. My daughter flew in from college. We were all so excited, so proud, so ready to celebrate this moment that felt like the culmination of everything we had worked for. The ceremony was elegant and overwhelming. I sat in the audience wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, watching as other authors were honored for their work. The host talked about the power of stories to change lives, to help children through difficult times, to create empathy and understanding in a fractured world. My husband squeezed my hand as they announced my category. My daughter, now a beautiful young woman with dreams of her own, smiled at me from the audience. I felt like I was living in a dream, like the scared girl who had once slept on a mattress on the floor could never have imagined this moment. Then they announced the presenter for my award. "Please welcome our distinguished guest, a leader in education reform and family advocacy, the Honorable." And they said my father's name. The world stopped. The applause seemed to come from very far away. I watched him walk onto the stage, older now, gray-haired and dignified in his expensive suit. He looked exactly like the man I remembered, and nothing like him at all. 25 years. 25 years since he'd watched me walk out of his house with my suitcases and my broken heart. 25 years since he'd chosen his reputation over his daughter. And now he was here, holding my award, preparing to honor the work I'd built from the ashes of his rejection. He began to speak about the importance of stories that help children through trauma, about the power of literature to heal wounded hearts. He talked about resilience and hope and the strength of the human spirit. He talked about all the things I had learned to be true, all the things he had never taught me. I thought about not going up. I thought about staying in my seat and letting the moment pass. But then I thought about my daughter, watching from the audience. I thought about all the children who would read my stories. I thought about the 17-year-old girl who had chosen love over fear, and I knew what I had to do. I walked up those steps slowly, my heart pounding but my head held high. The applause was thunderous, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. I reached the podium and looked out at the audience, then turned to face my father. He was holding out the award, a crystal sculpture that caught the stage lights and threw rainbows across the ceiling. His eyes met mine, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker there, recognition, maybe even pride. but it was 25 years too late. "Thank you," I said into the microphone, my voice steady and clear. "This award honors stories that help children through difficult times. Stories about courage, about love, about the strength we find when we're forced to stand alone." I paused, looking out at the audience, then back at my father. Some of us learn early that love isn't guaranteed, that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us will choose their own comfort over our well-being, but we also learn that we can create our own families, our own definitions of home, our own versions of success. The audience was completely silent now. I could see my husband and daughter in the front row, both of them understanding exactly what was happening. "This award is beautiful," I continued, "but I cannot accept it from someone who taught me that love comes with conditions, who showed me that a parent's pride can be withdrawn as easily as it's given, who chose politics over family, reputation over relationship." I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the audience. My father's face had gone pale, but I wasn't done. 25 years ago, I was 17 years old and pregnant, and I needed my family. Instead of support, I was given an ultimatum. Instead of love, I was given shame. Instead of a home, I was given the street. Because my existence, my choices, my very humanity was inconvenient to someone else's ambitions. My voice grew stronger. I built my life from that rejection. I turned that pain into purpose. I created stories that tell children they are worthy of love, no matter what mistakes they make. I built a business that publishes books for kids who feel different, who feel alone, who need to know that someone understands. I looked directly at my father now. Instead, I accept this award on behalf of every child who has ever been told they aren't good enough, every teenager who has been abandoned for making human mistakes, every young parent who has had to choose between love and acceptance. This is for all of us who learned that sometimes the family that matters most is the one we create ourselves. I turned back to my father, who was still holding the award. "I've built a beautiful life," I said, my voice softer now but no less clear. "A life filled with the unconditional love you never learned how to give. I don't need your approval anymore. I never did." I didn't take the award. I didn't shake his hand. I simply walked off the stage, back to my husband and daughter, back to the family that had chosen me just as fiercely as I had chosen them. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Then, slowly, the applause began. Not polite ceremony applause, but something deeper. Something that recognized truth when they heard it. My daughter was crying when I reached my seat. She threw her arms around me and whispered, "Mom, you were incredible." My husband held us both, and for a moment we were our own little island of love in that sea of strangers. Later, people would ask me if I regretted it, if I wished I had handled it differently. But I think about my daughter, who came up to me after the ceremony with tears in her eyes and said, "Mom, I am so proud of you." I think about my husband, who held me that night and told me I had been magnificent. I think about the letters I received from readers who said my words had given them permission to speak their own truths. And I think about that 17-year-old girl, walking out of her childhood home with everything she owned in 2 suitcases. She couldn't have imagined that her story would lead here, to this moment of quiet justice. She couldn't have known that the love she chose to protect would grow into something so beautiful and strong. The award sits in someone else's office now. I don't know whose, and I don't care. Because I learned that night that some victories aren't about what you take with you. Sometimes they're about what you leave behind. I built my life from rejection and turned it into something beautiful. That's worth more than any award. That's worth more than any parent's approval. That's worth everything. My daughter is a writer now too, crafting her own stories of courage and love. She's never known a world where her mother's love came with conditions. She's never had to choose between being herself and being accepted. And that might be the greatest victory of all. In the end, we don't always get the parents we deserve. But we can choose to become the parents our children need. We can choose to love without conditions. We can choose to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of our past. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to stand on a stage and tell the world exactly who we are and who we refuse to be. The story I wrote about the Fox family was really about us all along, about learning that home isn't a place or a person who might abandon you. Home is the love you carry with you, the family you create, the stories you tell, and the courage you find to keep going when the world tells you to stop. That's the story I wanted to tell. That's the story that mattered. If you've ever been underestimated, ever been told you weren't good enough, or ever had to choose love over acceptance, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Your story matters too. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about finding strength in the broken places and building something beautiful from the ruins, please subscribe. Because we all deserve to know that our struggles can become our greatest victories, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to accept less than we deserve.